20th Congressional District have unlocked the order in which they will speak. We will ask them to speak for 5 minutes. The time keepers are over here, and they'll give a 1 minute, 30-second stop signal. And after that, the audience will be asking you some questions. Our first speaker is DioGuardi, Republican Conservative.
This way. This way.
We're expecting a podium. Fine. Good evening. Pleased to be here to discuss the issues that are important and to debate the issues important to determine the representation of the 20th Congressional District for the 100th Congress. We are entering the 100th Congress on January the 1st. Something I'd like to discuss that you may have read in the paper today, we've now seen that the British intelligence people have found conclusive evidence that Syria planned in their embassy in London involving the Syrian ambassador himself to Great Britain, an act of terror. And that was the failed attempt to do away with 375 people on the El Al Israeli jet. I think that this is another example of how terrible these acts can be. You'll recall that this was an Arab who was inviting his Irish girlfriend back to Israel to be married, and he put in the bag that she was carrying the bombs that were supposed to go off. And thank God the British intelligence people were good enough to spot that. I think that Margaret Thatcher acted well in severing diplomatic relations today with Syria for this kind of an act, and in expelling the embassy personnel from the country. I think we've got to understand that Syria is a staunch ally of radical Arab nations, such as Libya and Iran, and I think they've demonstrated that they will do anything to accomplish their political goals in the Middle East. I think Mrs. Thatcher deserves our praise, and I was happy to see that President Reagan today recalled our ambassador, William Eagleton, in order to discuss these events and to evaluate what we would do diplomatically here as well. I believe that the United States should strongly consider expelling Syrian personnel from this country. I think this is not just to show solidarity with the people in England, but I think it's more important to show that we will never tolerate, never, the use of embassy property in a host country, such as they did in Great Britain. And this is nothing that can ever be tolerated, and that we will act in kind in expelling these people as well. These are acts of terrorism, and any time that a host embassy is used for this purpose, I think that deserves our immediate action. I think President Reagan has made it clear, especially in the case of Libya, that we will act firmly in the face of this kind of terrorism. And I think we've put, I hope, President Assad of Syria on notice that we mean business. Now, the reason why this is an important way to begin this debate is that this is a clear difference between Ms. Abzug and Joe DioGuardi. I was happy to see the other night, or a few days ago, Ms. Abzug changing her mind and agreeing with me that it was time that we apply the death penalty as an appropriate penalty when it came to terrorism. Hopefully tonight she will also change her mind and agree that we must take affirmative action, very strong action, in retaliating against those countries that will seek to impose such terrorism and in a wanton way kill American lives, in fact kill the lives of Americans or allies in their host countries. I think that this is an important issue, and I think that President Reagan did well in retaliating against Libya as he did, and at this point Ms. Abzug still takes a considerable issue with that kind of action in the face of terrorism. This is an important issue. I think we must be tough on terrorism, and there's very little doubt in my mind that Ms. Abzug and I differ on this subject. On another subject, I think it's important to recognize what this card is. This is the card that I use to vote as your congressman every day in Congress. It's an automatic computer card. this is the most expensive credit card in the world. This card has no limit. When you or your spouse get a call from American Express or Diners, when you've reached your $2,000 limit or your $5,000 limit, you know that economic reality has set in. You sit down, you evaluate your priorities. Not with this card. We recently reached the $2 trillion limit. We're up to 2.2. And what do? We keep bumping the limit, passing it on to the kids. It's obviously credit card government at its worst. We must stop it. I've dealt with this card responsibly. I called 18 months ago for a freeze in the military budget. I did not want to see emasculation of domestic programs with anything more than a freeze in that military budget. I think it's important that we understand that and in the future deal with qualitative judgments, not superficial quantitative judgments in dealing with the budget deficit. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker is the Democratic candidate, Bella Abzug.
Good evening. I run for Congress because I care about the children. And when I was in the Congress, I voted for programs that would help them in education. Mr. Joe DioGuardi has received from a nonpartisan group rating all Democrats and Republicans 33% for his failure to vote for higher education, for his failure to vote, and for his voting against school lunch and school nutrition. He was rated 33%, one of the 4 worst of the members of the New York delegation. I run for Congress because I want to address the main question that we confront in this district, and that is the need for affordable housing. In the Congress of the United States, I work very hard to create programs to buy small homes, to assist people who are elderly, to provide special whole housing for the elderly, and provide moderate housing for all people. Mr. Joe DioGuardi has voted against those programs, voted against $500 million for reserve fund to buy moderate homes, voted against programs to assist the elderly, $231 million cuts, voted to reduce in half the cost of low-income units, deserving a rating from the National League of Cities, 0%, one of the worst. I run for Congress because I believe that it's important that individuals have a right of choice. Mr. Joe DioGuardi has voted against the right of choice to save the life of the mother, for rape, for incest, voted against family planning programs, rating him one of the 2 worst by the Planned Parenthood Federation, 12.5%. I run for Congress because I care about the environment. We all care about the environment. I received a 100% rating, a 94% rating, and a 94% rating when I was in the Congress of the United States. Joe DioGuardi was rated 33% by the League of Conservation Voters, one of the 5 worst in the delegation of New York. I run for Congress because I care about arms control. I care about providing peace on this earth for our children and for our children's children. Joe DioGuardi is voted 14%, one of the 5 worst, by the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. He's ready to send our money to a military enterprise in Nicaragua, which is just the beginning of what happened in Vietnam. I run for Congress because I care about the fact that women need to get equal pay for their work. Mr. Joe DioGuardi has voted against equal pay for their work. I run for Congress because I believe that I have a history in which I was able to represent a constituency and brought $6 billion worth of programs into the state in all of these concerns. Mr. Joe DioGuardi has failed to represent the needs and the concerns of the people in the district. He is talking here tonight about a very important subject, one which should not be used politically, one which should be used soberly, and that is the question of how, in fact, do we deal with terrorism. This is not a new subject for me. I served in the Congress of the United States from 1971 to 1977. I was a leading proponent of suspending all kinds of foreign assistance to nations engaging in air piracy. I also supported a measure to require the President to suspend flights of foreign nations assisting terrorists. And I supported a bill that called for international cooperation and prosecution of air piracy. The fact is that at the time that we were in the Congress, the Supreme Court had decided against death penalty. And what we voted for in the Congress at the time was to provide for a discretionary provision in the Congress of the United States. Instead of having a mandatory penalty, since the Supreme Court had decided against capital punishment, we proposed a discretionary proposal. And it's so interesting that we should talk about Syria tonight because obviously if you're running for office, you're going to relate to what's happening. And so it happens that before I heard you, Joe, but just because I read the newspaper and because I care and because I have a continuation of care, not just suddenly because I'm in Congress for the first time, but because I've been there and I've been fighting all of my life for peace and against terrorism and against violence. I sent a telegram to President Reagan saying I congratulate you for withdrawing the Ambassador William Eagleton from Damascus, and I called upon the President for even more stringent measures, including breaking off diplomatic ties with Syria. With conclusive evidence of Syria's active support and protection of terrorists, we must break off relations with Assad's government. And so, I'll be glad to shake your hand when I'm finished. And way before that time, way before that time, Joe, way before that time, I called upon after the Karachi and the Istanbul incident, I called upon the President to take stringent measures to get joint action, economic sanctions, political sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and suggested that if all those sanctions were taken and was necessary, we might even have to take joint military action. And so you see, we differ because I have, I think, a more rounded out position on the subject. Thank you very much.
Please state your name. If you would like to address it to a specific candidate, you may of course do so. Each of the candidates will have an opportunity to respond. You have 2 minutes for your response. And with that, I can now lay you to the floor.
Millwood. Many of us are very concerned, Mr. DioGuardi, that your voting record on arms control issues has become so inconsistent as to be an incomprehensible muddle. On the one hand, you vote to stop MX and then turn around and vote against adherence to SALT II limits. You vote for a comprehensive test ban and then turn around and vote against the ASEX testing moratorium.
Can we have your question,
Do
please?
you have a position on arms control?
Yes, I do, Louise. I think I have a very logical position on arms control. Number one, it took a lot of courage for me as a freshman Republican to tell the President 6 months into my term that I'd witnessed so much waste on government operations, on procurement, that I can't in good conscience vote for one dime increase, let alone the 8% that Cap Weinberger was looking for, which would have been $24 billion, especially at a time when we were trying to, or at least the administration was trying to emasculate programs that I was supporting, like student aid, like the SBA, and things like that. So I think that I've taken a very responsible position using the credit card, the voting card that I've shown you, that where I've said, number one, if the military needs money for essential programs, and there are essential programs like SDI and some others, we must get the money from non-essential programs. We've got to get the military to deal with the $300 billion budget responsibly, because that's what they have in there, $292 billion. Would you believe we actually cut, in real dollars, $4 billion from the military budget from last year to this year? So I think that there is a bipartisan movement in Congress to say, hey, we've had enough. And when you hear about the $7,000 coffee pot and the $700 toilet seat, that's really the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to it because we know that the waste is structural, it's systemic. I think that my voting record on arms control is a logical one. I've proven that I'm an independent. I voted with the President when I think he's right, and I vote against him when I think he's wrong. And I think we've seen that on MX. We've seen that on several other things that have gotten me visits to the White House, by the way, to discuss those positions. And under great pressure, I stood my ground. So I think I'm bringing the mentality of someone who's your neighbor, a citizen. I never ran for anything in my life before I ran for Congress 2 years ago. And I'm bringing that independent, common sense, business-like thinking with me to see whether I can create a balance between military and domestic programs that works.
I think the inconsistency is a very important point that's been made here. I think it's important to recognize that when you vote for chemical weapons, as Joe DioGuardi did, when you vote for ASAT testing, as Joe DioGuardi did, when you vote to allow the bursting of the limits of the SALT II, as Joe DioGuardi did, and when you vote for Graham-Rudman, as Joe DioGuardi did, which makes it clear that we have to make an automatic cut in domestic programs, we have to ask ourselves why. And that's because the deficit that has really been created by this administration that Joe DioGuardi supports has come about because of a doubling of a military budget, which is far beyond what is needed for our national security. And the question of whether or not one is prepared to go beyond waste, because we all know that the Pentagon has never seen a missile that it doesn't like, or a toilet seat that it can't afford. But you must go beyond waste in order to prove that you understand that it's important to have a clean defense, a safe defense, but not an excessive defense. And if you're prepared to spend $1 trillion for weapons in space when we don't have decent space here on Earth, then I think the question of whether you're really for arms control is up for speculation. And I believe that, in fact, in the last analysis, your voting record is such that it indicates that you are prepared to sacrifice, as you have, programs in our district for housing, for senior citizens, for children, for education, for environment, for all of the programs that we need to take care of the homeless, because you favor the commitment of funds for the military, and because you're not prepared to vote the kind of funds that have to be voted for domestic concerns. And you're asking us to sacrifice way beyond what is needed for our national security, and in fact you're creating a national insecurity by your votes on arms control.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, I would like to just
Your
ask
name,
that,
please?
my name is James Wilkinson, I'm a resident of Newcastle and I'm a student at SUNY Purchase. And I would like to ask, you brought up to all the candidates, the idea of terrorism was brought up as one of the issues in the campaign. How do we justify as a country, we have, I think everyone knows this, we have the greatest arms sales of any country in the world, the Soviet Union second, but we are the first. Why are we how can we expect to be selling all these weapons into the world market and not ever expect it to be used against us? And that's my
Okay, well, it's a very good question. One of the reasons that I took such a strong stand against any arms to the Arab countries was that I was afraid that Saudi Arabia, Jordan, those countries who did not recognize Israel's right to exist explicitly, those arms could very well fall into the hands of terrorists, and that would create a big problem for Israel and certainly for ourselves in the Middle East. It's a difficult question. I think that the issue of arms sales, I think it's important that our NATO allies have the benefit of the weaponry that we have. Who's to say that some of this would not fall into the hands of terrorists? I think that that's a good point. One of the very reasons why we need to discuss continuously, and I do believe we'll have another summit next year. I think Reykjavik worked out very well for us. I was disappointed we didn't have the agreement, but I think that we've crossed some bridges now and got into areas of discussion where we now see the possibility of the elimination of all nuclear weapons. The reason for it is that it's theoretically possible for a nuclear bomb to get into the hands of a terrorist. The very reason we need an SDI. Because if, theoretically, the Soviet Union and the United States eliminates all offensive weapons, how do we know that there's not another nut country in the world, another Gaddafi, with that one bomb that could hold the rest of the world hostage? So we do need a safety net like SDI. But I think your point's very well taken. We've got to use many qualitative judgments in deciding to whom we sell arms. And I think one prime example was what we did in Israel's case in not selling, or at least in my vote, not selling arms to the Arabs.
Thank you. Excuse me, Mrs. Abzug.
The question you raise is really a very fundamental one. And what has occurred since the termination, certainly, of World War II and the dropping of the atom bomb is a very intensive militarization of our culture and of cultures in other countries as well, especially in the Soviet Union. And what has happened, instead of each of these systems, in our own country especially, where we have influence, exporting ideas, exporting culture, exporting trade, exporting innovations, exporting exchanges, we have come to rely upon a many billions of dollars industry which produces all kinds of weapons of violence. And I think that it's not only the weapons that we sell as the arms sales, the largest arms salespersons, but we together with the Soviet Union probably sell about $800 billion worth of arms each year. But we also are developing a notion of violence or an attitude of violence by, for example, our failure in this country to strengthen instead of to weaken gun control laws, as I believe Joe DioGuardi has voted for. And by voting to increase military budgets instead of finding the ways in which we can say that international disputes have to vigorously be settled through diplomatic, political, and negotiating means, we continue to find the ways in which we can build bigger arsenals and find the ways to arm our allies, and sometimes not our allies, as in the Middle East and among the Arab nations. And I think that this requires a terrific overhauling of view and a point of view. And I think that the Congress has begun to understand that, because they simply can't deal with the fact that we are so lopsided in our priorities. And I hope to get to the Congress to help those elements in the Congress who have the guts and the courage to say, we've got to begin to settle things differently. We've got to turn down the arms race.
Yes, ma'am. Here. Yes.
Paula Hume from Newcastle. As well as reading about terrorism today, I read that women in this country still earn only 65 cents to $1. And I think the League of Women Voters is an interesting forum to hear the candidates discuss that, or whether that is an issue.
Yes, certainly, I'd be glad to. Well, I think that it's regrettable that we have a dual system of employment in this country, and that many of the jobs that women originally came into the workplace to assume were evaluated at a lower rate than that of jobs that were previously or traditionally occupied by males. 80% of the women in this country are still occupying the lowest paid jobs in this country. And that's no longer feasible, because the majority of women are working and they need to support themselves. They're either single, widowed, separated, divorced, or married to men who do not make enough to support their families. And therefore, there is taking place the need to examine this very serious question, because there are also women who are heads of households who have to support themselves. And there has been legislation in the Congress of the United States to examine the classifications of jobs that women and men hold to determine if there is discrimination, and to ascertain whether there cannot be a standard of eliminating discrimination to provide equal pay for work of comparable value. I have supported that kind of legislation for a long, long time, and fought for it in many state legislatures throughout the country while I've been out of Congress, and would support the legislation in the Congress, which, by the way, Joe DioGuardi voted against the right of women to be able to support themselves, to be able to get a decent wage from which they can help themselves eat, clothe themselves, help their families thrive, and help themselves survive. And I think that this is a crucial question as to whether there is a commitment to more than half the population and to the families in this district. The families in this district depend upon the mothers and the wives and the sisters and the daughters to help make a living. And when you vote against even a study to determine whether their failure to make this living can be dealt with by eliminating discrimination, then you show no concern whatsoever for humanity.
Thank you.
Well, once again, though, you're mistaken. I've supported equal pay for equal work.
Didn't you vote against the provision in Congress?
This is that with courtesy, please.
It's a question. Answer the question.
You're going to terrorize me during this debate?
Might be a good idea. Might be a good idea.
What's going to start all over again? Set the time.
Could you repeat the question, please? I think when you hear these statistics that are quoted by Ms. Abzug, understand that there are many organizations that are really Democrat rating organizations. They say they're bipartisan, but you can't believe the kinds of votes that are put into that are really not germane to many of those issues, and we could debate that all night. But the point is, I do support equal pay for equal work. I co-sponsored legislation to create on-site daycare centers because I believe one of the critical challenges being faced by women today is to be able to go to work, and many of them want to go to work, whether they're single-parent families or they're in with double parents, but they don't feel comfortable about where they leave their kids. And we've seen the terrible example just in Mount Vernon, in our own district, of the child sexual abuse situation. And we must do something to create or to bring creative solutions to this so that we have on-site daycare centers in these corporate complexes, and we have to bring the incentives to the corporations to do that. And that's not enough. I think we've got to create other incentives to create these daycare centers in other places as well. Look at where we've been and look at the direction we're going in. When President Reagan inherited the role of presidency from President Carter, we were humiliated on the foreign front. I mean, we couldn't even pull off a rescue attempt in the desert in Iran, if you recall. Our helicopters went down to kill additional people. We've put 10 million people to work since that time. Many of them are women. Women are coming into the workforce more than ever before. And God bless them. We want them, and we want to give them equal pay for equal work. When President Carter left and passed the baton to President Reagan, interest rates were 21%. Inflation was 15%. Who do you think suffered? The wealthy in this country? No. Many of the women who were dependent on fixed incomes and child support payments. And many of them weren't getting that child support. And I sponsored legislation to withhold taxes from any spouse who leaves a working spouse with kids. And that's the kind of creative thinking I'm trying to bring to the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. Yes, sir.
My name's Bob Kurtzig. I'm from White Plains. Sergeant DioGuardi, I heard you say that you have a logical position on arms. I'd like to follow up on that if I can. You say you want to freeze the military budget, although you voted against the budget that contained a freeze on the floor of the House. Yet you say you also support Star Wars, which could cost over $1 trillion.
Could we have your question,
Are you
please?
prepared to terminate funding for housing, education, the environment, and all other social programs in order to fund a system that most scientists believe will not work?
Absolutely not. I will not emasculate domestic programs, and I think I've shown that. And when you hear the rhetoric from Ms. Abzug, understand that words can be used to twist things around. I voted against a 100% increase in low-income housing, but I did vote for an additional 5,000 units. If you listen to her, it sounds like I voted to cut them. I didn't cut anything. I voted to slow the growth because I realized we had to balance the needs of the domestic economy against what we have to do in the military. And that's why I came for the freeze. Now you talk about the Strategic Defense Initiative. Whether it costs $1 trillion, $3 trillion, or $5 trillion, whatever is voted on, that money has to come out of the $292 billion. It's not going to be spent in 1 year. It's a research program. It's going to take at least 10 years. And if there's something that's so wrong with the program that it can't work, what are the Soviets worried about? Everybody says, here's a system that's not going to work. And yet it brought them to the table the first time. It got them there talking about deep arms reductions the second time in missiles and whatnot. And it's probably going to get them back again. Why? Because they know in their heart of hearts that it does work, that we have the technology they don't have. They're at least 10 years behind us in computer technology. Why? Because they don't let their population use computers. They don't like information. Information and communication is the currency of democracy. The Soviet Union doesn't believe that. And that's why they're so far behind. Now look at what they've done with the Helsinki Accords. If you think Reykjavik wasn't a success, think twice. When did they ever keep one agreement? Helsinki Accords. The Bulgarians terrorized ethnic Turks. Yugoslavs terrorized ethnic Albanians. And the Soviet Union, Soviet Jews. Are we going to put up with that? Are we going to have to make an agreement on their terms? Again, they can't even feed their own people. And they won't even respect basic human rights agreements. I think that's the real issue. But no, I will not emasculate domestic programs for military programs. We've got to create a balance, and certainly our national security cannot be held hostage to anything.
Thank you. Ms. Abzug?
Well, the record speaks for itself, and I think that it doesn't change by reason of the fact that organizations which are nonpartisan and which rate Democrats and Republicans alike cannot be made into partisan organizations because you don't like the ratings. You earned the ratings, and you got them. The fact is that in our district, there has taken place an emasculation of programs. You take the vote on Graham Rudman. You voted for it. Andy O'Rourke, who is the county executive, a Republican of your party, of one of your parties. I mean, I don't know if he's in the Conservative Party, as you are, but one of your parties, the Republican Party, has called this a disaster and has said that it would cost the Westchester County $246 million and require, as it is in effect, a 10% increase in taxes for the county. Now, you ran on a program of making sure you would not increase taxes, yet your vote in Graham Rudman will result directly in taxing the people in Westchester. You voted against the $500 million program for housing, which young people could use for moderate housing. You voted against assisted housing for the elderly, $231 million cut. And you did vote to cut in half, which is $1 billion less for a program for housing in low-income units. And you did vote against higher education appropriations, which we need desperately for our young people to go to college. And you did vote against programs for the seniors, including Medicare, meriting you a 30% rating from the National Council for Senior Citizens. You did vote to cut $6 billion of the water program originally that we needed for conservation, and that's why you got the rating that you got from the League of Conservation Voters, which has lots of Republicans in it, as well as Democrats. And so what I want to point out is that your voting pattern, your voting for the Reagan program has in fact resulted in emasculating programs for the people here in this district and what they need.
I have a question for Mrs. Abzug that I'd like to leave open to the other candidates too, if they care to comment on it. Mrs. Abzug, we appreciate the concerns that you have on the national issues, but we all live in Westchester County here, and I'd like to ask you, how do you feel about charges that, first of all, you have not lived in Westchester County for a very long time. Second of all, only 10% of your contributions are actually coming from Westchester County. And third, there seems to be a Manhattan, Hollywood blitz to this campaign. I saw Warren Beatty over there before on Joan Rivers last week. What do you say to charges like that?
Would you like Warren Beatty to be deprived of his right to listen?
You live in Westchester.
I mean, I see. You have, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take that time. Well, I have to tell you what it's all about, okay? I raised my children in Westchester. Martin and I, my husband, recently departed, unfortunately. I'm sorry he's not here tonight because he's the one who encouraged me to come back to Westchester. We raised our children in Westchester, in Mount Vernon, where we lived for 14 years, where we spent a lot of time becoming involved very deeply in the community concerns, in education, in the PTA, environment questions, and peace issues here in Westchester. And it was there that I received my first experience in community activism, and it encouraged me to run for office. I, at the encouragement of my husband especially, who wanted to return to Westchester, came back to Westchester to practice law. I maintain an office in White Plains, and I live in White Plains. And it was here, when I decided to run again for office, having been out of office for a while, that I felt I had my beginnings. And just as I became involved in politics on behalf of my children and other people's children, I felt right now that the future of our children is at stake. And it would be a good place for me to consider running for office, since it's a place that I have deep roots in. It's a very common thing for members of Congress to run for office and then run for another office, perhaps not win, and then decide to run in a place where they either came from or raised their children or were born. It's not unusual. It's a false issue. The issue you have to decide is who can best represent this district. I've had a lot of experience. I served 6 years in the Congress of the United States. I developed programs, many of which affected Westchester. I was responsible for the Sawville River Flood Control Program. I was responsible for programs of commuter transportation on the commuter lines that you take. I was responsible for water sewage treatment plants right here in Westchester. I was a senior member of the of the Public Works Committee. And so I think I have a lot to offer, and I belong here, and I have a right to be here, and I will be here. And I'll probably be, not your congressman, because Elmsford is not in the district, but I'll probably be the congressman.
Okay, well, I disagree with you, Ms. Abzug. I think this is a very real issue. I've lived in Westchester County for 29 years, the most recent 29 years of my life. And I've built up very meaningful coalitions because during the time when I was a citizen, like the very good people here, I was on the IDA of Westchester County, the Industrial Development Authority. I decided with a board how we should use this very valuable AAA bond rating that Westchester has and no other county in the state has. I was on the board of the Phoenix House and the Boy Scouts. I was elected president of my homeowners association for 7 years. I just recently got rid of that job. They finally found a replacement. But I've done my best to work with, at the grassroots, people in this county and to work with the elected officials. The problem you have, Ms. Abzug, is not necessarily the fact that you just moved in, but it goes deeper than that. Your concerns and you're more comfortable with the associations you have in the West Village and West Hollywood, but not Westchester.
I think you're jealous.
Well, at least you got me on the Joe River show. In any case,
You should reject that, dear.
I already
It's
have.
Hollywood.
But I'll get some equivalency. I'm not finished with my time, am I?
No, but I don't know how to.
Will the gentle lady from Greenwich Village yield, please?
Absolutely.
In any case, I do believe that this is an issue, but it's an issue of substance. It really is not important to spend 10 years here, 5 years. The issue is who you're most comfortable with. I feel comfortable dealing with the mayors when they have problems, as Mayor Noto did with that flood control program that Dick Ottinger tried for 10 years to get. It came down to me to get that. I called the White House. I get return calls. I can't imagine that you would get a return call from the White House. I'll rest my case on that.
Stay over here.
As a result of the shooting down, Margaret Everly, White Plains. As a result of the shooting down of a plane carrying Eugene Hasenfuss in Nicaragua, it appears that, contrary to the directives of the U.S. Congress, the CIA and possibly the Vice President of the United States have been directly involved in the supplying the Contra mercenary killers with military supplies. This action runs...
May we have your question, please, sir?
Okay, I'm not starting. It's a direct and illegal attack on the Neutrality Act of the United States. There is a move in Congress to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the process. This is the question. Okay? There is a move in Congress to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate the possibility of illegal actions in the executive branch of the CIA. Would the candidates please respond to the possibility of supporting such a move in Congress?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would like to start?
I think, I'll be glad to.
Okay.
I think it's quite shocking to see what may be the abuse of process and the abuse of power in this particular situation. What it reflects is a violation of trust that the executive branch has with the Congress and with the public. Congress voted against originally certain aid to Nicaragua, and what simply has happened is that the structures of government, which do not belong to a president or a vice president to manipulate, were utilized, or at least it is alleged that they were utilized, for the purpose of carrying on illegal, unauthorized activity in Nicaragua. And I believe that that will result in a total breakdown of democracy and government and the democratic process as Congress and the executive branch are required to abide by. I think it requires investigation by the intelligence committees of the Congress, I think it requires investigation by the Government Operations Committee of Congress. Here's a chance for you to do something, Joe, because you're on one of those committees. And it requires an opportunity, I think, and it requires whatever steps the Congress deems necessary in order to assert the regular operation of government. And if a government is simply allowed to take money and use discretionary funds, or funds which are not even discretionary funds, for the purpose of acting illegally, then I think a very serious thing and breakdown in government has happened, and that has been the history of this government with respect to Nicaragua, and those affirmative steps must be taken immediately. And Joe, I urge you as a member of the Government Operations Committee, use what little influence you have, because you know, Republicans don't have much influence in the minority in the House of Representatives, and I'm sympathetic with you. And just let me say to you, that when I was in the Congress and I called up Mr. Nixon or Mr. Ford, I served under 2 Republican administrations, they moved real fast because they knew they'd hear from a lot of people if they didn't.
Well, I'll answer that. Anytime, I think the issue of accountability goes far beyond numbers. And I have made the issue of accountability with numbers one of my primary concerns, as you know, because of my financial background. I think that the government today is going too far in that the taxpayers are not getting a dollar's worth of goods and services for a dollar's worth of taxes. Accountability also reaches past the numbers into how the various branches of government are handling their responsibilities. Now, you have a current case here where all the facts are not in, Margaret. I'll be looking very carefully at that. I agree that if there's been illegal, covert activity that has not been sanctioned by Congress, and they've gone around the appropriate committees, and I know Senator Goldwater, a staunch Republican, has himself challenged the administration when this has happened, I would be the first to join with them that that's not the way to do business. So I am looking for the facts on this. I don't think that we've seen all of them. The issue of Nicaragua is a very volatile issue, and you know that we don't agree on that. But I can tell you this, that it was my concern about a report that they couldn't account for $27 million of funds the first time around that led me initially to reconsider whether I would not vote for that. But I got enough information where I felt that they were tracking the monies and that national security was still the major issue there. Now, every year I will look at those facts to see how I will vote on that.
Well, it's a matter of cost, particularly of Star Wars. Now, the congressman showed his credit card, and I know what happens when you overspend the credit card. And even the U.S. government, I think, is finding out when it gets up to maybe the limit of its credit card, it feels the pinch too. And you say you support Star Wars, or some of you support Star Wars, something like that. And yet, how are you going to finance it? Or how are we going to finance it? The Secretary of Defense Schlesinger said it would cost $1 trillion. How can we finance that kind of expense on a credit card? And the other thing is, again about Star Wars, another question, that is, how can you have negotiated settlement on reduction of weapons, nuclear weapons, with the Soviet Union, and have Star Wars view of what happened in the summer? And the contradiction there between what the Russians feel is their security, vital security interests, which Star Wars is in conflict with. So how do you resolve those contradictions there? Thank you.
Well, let's talk about the one on cost. I'll go back to what I said before. What we're saying in Congress, and that's the Senate and the House, is that the Strategic Defense Initiative is an essential system for our national security.
I want you to know that the tape is running out. If you'd like this to be on a program, then I think we can have it about in 1 minute before, okay? And while we're having this 1-minute technical
Program. But the point is, within the context of the overall budget, you have another massive budget. It's called the military budget. And this year the number is $292 billion. That's an awful lot of money. I think there's good reason to believe that that money is not being managed as well as it should be managed. What Congress is saying is that we must get under the numbers and find out which weapon systems are working and which are needed, and which are not working and which are not needed, and start making some qualitative judgments. For the first time in history, would you believe it, we eliminated a weapon. It was called the Sergeant York gun. $3 billion. But we already spent $1 billion before we eliminated it. What a waste. We've got to do better at seeing these things up front. But with Strategic Defense Initiative, what we're saying as a Congress, Senate, and House is that this is something that is very germane, essential to the national security of the country. It's a defense system. We believe it will work. It's a research program. We don't know all the answers up front. The point is, the monies that will be spent, and everybody waves $1 trillion or more, you're talking about monies that are going to be spent over a long period of time. And we will vote each year within each budget to decide what it is we can afford this year as we did. I think it was $3.2 billion. And it wasn't the $5 that the President asked for. The point is that we must continue to send a message to the military that they've got to find money for essential programs from non-essential programs. And from what I've seen, there are a lot of non-essential programs still in the military today.
When you buy a house, you usually mortgage it. And you consider
Observe, any weapon being requested by the Pentagon, which we started out by doing research, as we are now doing, and then ended up with a full-fledged entity, which very often was obsolete before it was finished. This is so in the bomber program, the Sergeant York, which the Congressman referred to. I'm sure if he was there, he would have voted for it. Some of us were screaming and hollering about it all the time, but they didn't listen until finally it was abandoned. Now the SDI is becoming a very interesting question in this country. 50 Nobel laureates, 700 national members of the National Academy of Sciences, former cabinet secretaries of defense and state have raised serious questions as to its feasibility. Right now, President Reagan is on a big campaign to try to suggest that it's our only salvation. Well, if it was our only salvation, we'd be in real trouble. Because most people admit, even the administration, that 450 missiles can come through, which is enough to create a nuclear winter to destroy civilization as we know it, even if they made it perfect. In other words, there's a technical question as to its feasibility. We don't have the time to get into it tonight. But the idea of starting on a course, other than laboratory testing, of a weapon like this, and to sacrifice, Joe, as you and the others in the Congress are doing, the needs that we have every day just to survive in our communities, is really indefensible. You're not going to suggest that we don't have a strong defense. You brag about the fact that you've doubled the defense program since Mr. Reagan has been there, and we've had to sacrifice for it. We've had to give up our human needs. There isn't any place to cut anymore, Joe. There isn't any place to cut anymore. You managed to vote for every appropriation that cut human needs that came before you. And I say that's why you can't really continue to represent this district. And as far as Star Wars is concerned, we have to be able to say the Emperor has no clothes, or at least we have to be prepared to admit at some point, very soon, that it has no clothes. Otherwise, we won't have it. We won't have any clothes. We won't have any homes. We won't have any shoes.
Have informed me that they have still other places to go tonight, so we are going to have to close this, and in fact, they will be giving their closing statement of 3 minutes in reverse order, so ready to start.
You know, one of the reasons I'm running for Congress is that I have always fought very hard as a lawyer for the rights of all people, to hold whatever views they wish, to worship as they please, to live as they please, to read what they want to read, and to think what they want to think, and to pursue whatever religion they want to pursue. And I find it very dangerous to hear, both from the White House and from members of Congress like Joe DioGuardi and from Florence here, the idea that one point of view can overcome what is considered to be a constitutional right. Decide for yourself whether and when to have children. And I believe that the attack upon the Constitution and the right of an individual to choose is a very serious one. Just as a suggestion that we should have prayer in the schools is a serious attack upon the Constitution, which Mr. Joe DioGuardi supports. The right of the individual in our society and our system is important. And I think that I respect somebody to differ with me, but to suggest that there's only one point of view when the courts have decided It is a right of privacy under the First, Fourth, Ninth, and 15th and 14th Amendments, and that individuals have the right to choose, I think, is fundamental to our way of life. But I'm running for Congress because that kind of thinking, that denial of fundamental rights of decision-making is also reflective in what is happening in the Congress today by men like Joe DioGuardi. That it's okay for children not to get school lunch and go hungry, for families to lack shelter, for elderly not to have the kind of health care that they need, for us not to have the kind of beautiful environment which is protected. As long as we have some unclear weapon that at least on the surface appears to make us very strong, though in fact it is making us very weak. We need in this district a member of Congress that has the vision, the experience, and the ability, and the clout in the Congress to get the job done. That job has not been done by Joe DioGuardi. Not only because he's a minority in the House and he don't have much power, but because he hasn't shown the ability or the interest in representing the needs and the concerns, the fundamental living needs and concerns of the people in the district. You can't vote against housing and against education and against seniors and against the environment and against what women need and say that you're representing that district. I want to represent that district. I've done it before. I know how to bring home lots of programs for the people in the district that I represent. I know how to put my arms around the people and give them constituent services, which Joe DioGuardi has not done. He has had one office instead of 2 or 3, the way Dick Ottinger did. He is totally contrary to the tradition of representation in this district. He has voted wrong. He has not served the constituency. He has shown no leadership. And I believe that you need to change so that there is some hope that we can have a voice in Congress.
Thank you, Mr. Candidate is Joseph DioGuardi.
Isn't democracy wonderful? I get my turn. Now, I hesitated to use this again, Bella, but you forced me. Mario Cuomo, in 1977, turned to Bella one day and said, Bella, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying, and you're good at it.
Excuse me.
But he hasn't retracted that. In any case, it is so easy to twist one's voting record, and that's what you've heard tonight. I casted just last year over 400 votes. That was the second year of the first term. To just very quickly go through and pick here and pick there and distort is not fair when talking about a congressman's voting record, and I think you should know better than that. Why did I run for Congress? I ran for Congress because as a professional, as a citizen, I thought there was something wrong with the budget process. As a professional, I worked on the problems of New York City. Proxmire hired my firm. I saw firsthand the problems of that city and began to understand what could happen to the federal government. And you know something? I wasn't disappointed when I got to government, into Congress. The deficit was worse, the debt is larger, and the most incredible thing is that Congress does not have the ability, or its ability to deal with this is even less than I thought. This is the biggest challenge we face today. The reason why we need to put a limit on that credit card. And before Graham Rubbit, there wasn't a limit on that credit card. Even Tip O'Neill Bella said that the deficit would have been worse without Graham Rudman. Estimates are that if we didn't have Graham Rudman, 41 cents of every dollar by 1991 would just go to pay the interest on the debt. That is bankruptcy, whether it's your house, whether it's a business. And you know what would happen? The biggest program we would have would be interest on the national debt. And where does that money go? To wealthy people who could afford to buy bonds. And it comes right out of the mouths of the poor. So we need to put brakes on what's happening. Westchester has never had a clearer choice. I am your neighbor, community leader, an independent thinker, a businessman applying common sense, a moderate Republican. Just look at my voting record. I voted with the president when I thought he was right. I voted against him when I thought he was wrong. Ms. Abzug, an ultra-liberal radical. And don't take it from me. Let me quote from Richard Ottinger before the primary. Her stands are more extreme than what Westchester can accept. Dick Ottinger, the man we all respect. Ed Koch, Quote, "The radicals don't like me," close quote. He goes on to say, "By the radicals, I am talking about the Bella Abzugs," close quote. Now let's talk about Bella on Bella. In her own book, Bella says on radicalism, quote, "The trouble with this country is that it doesn't have and never has had a cohesive radical movement," close quote. Now I doubt if that's the representation this county is preparing itself as we go into the 100th Congress. I'm proud to say that I've been here 29 years, and I will continue the record of service that I've demonstrated for the last 2. Thank you very much.